When you think about Bram Stoker's Dracula, the picture that usually comes to mind is pretty straightforward.
Oh, yeah, it's the classic story.
It's this clean, simple narrative,
Yeah.
right? You have the pure, the good, uh, the righteous Victorian Englishman.
Armed with science and fair.
Exactly. And they're up against this ancient, terrifying force of just absolute pure evil. It's a morality play. Light versus darkness.
And that's certainly the story Stoker gives us on the surface. It's designed to read that way. But if you really dig in, if you start to look at the source material itself, I mean, the raw, unfiltered diaries and letters.
The frantic telegrams, Dr. Seward's clinical notes.
All of it. When you look at that, a much more unsettling story starts to emerge. It's far more psychological and honestly a lot more chilling.
Because the true horror in Dracula isn't just the Count.
Not by a long shot. The horror is what the Count reveals about the very society that's fighting him.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Okay.
Because what you're saying is that the line between the monster and the hero, it's not really a line at all. It's more of a deep, muddy blur.
It is.
So for this deep dive, our mission is to use these original texts, especially the journals from Jonathan Harker, Dr. Seward, Mina Harker, to just systematically deconstruct that whole traditional hero-villain dynamic.
Right. What if Dracula isn't just some individual threat? What if he's more like a mirror, reflecting the biggest anxieties of that age?
A mirror, I like that. So we're going to look at this through a few different lenses, right?
Exactly. We're going to use 3 dark lenses to kind of expose the rot that's just under that shiny Victorian surface.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, we'll look at Dracula as the embodiment of xenophobic anxiety. He's this external foreign threat, and he's designed to infect and dismantle the, civilized world.
I meant that.
Second, we're going to see Dracula as the collective shadow self of these incredibly repressed heroes.
Yeah.
He is the raw, primal desire that they have all bottled up.
They're finally. And I think this is probably the most provocative part of the whole text. We're going to analyze the absolutely horrific brutality.
It's shocking.
And the profound psychological control that the good guys use, all in the name of purity. It makes their actions, a lot of the time, almost indistinguishable from the violence they say they hate. So let's start where Stoker starts the terror. Jonathan Harker, the young solicitor, heading into Transylvania and just meticulously documenting everything.
Right. And even before he gets anywhere near the castle, the book is already building this geographical and political case against Dracula.
Setting the stage.
It's framing the entire novel, and it's absolutely critical. This is where the core fear comes from, the invasion psychology. Harker, who is this meticulous, rational English professional.
The ultimate modern man.
Yes. He documents all his research, and he notes that Transylvania is one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. He immediately stresses that, and this is a quote, "Every known superstition in the world is gathered into the horseshoe of the Carpathians."
That image, the horseshoe, is so powerful. It doesn't just sound like a location, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Like a trap.
It does. It's a container for everything they fear. So you have the West, represented by Harker, which is rational, modern, legally structured. And then you have the East, the Carpathians, which is framed as primal, superstitious, untamed.
And dangerous. Harker actually calls it a whirlpool that's just sucking civilization in. It's fascinating how the English mind in the book just immediately codes this entire region as pre-modern chaos.
And Dracula, the Count, is completely tied to this wild, anti-modern place through his bloodline and his history.
Harker tries to make sense of it, doesn't he? He lists the 4 distinct nationalities he finds there.
He does. The Saxons, the Wallachs, the Dacians, the Magyars, and the Seklis. He's trying to categorize them, to rationalize the mix of people, but Dracula just aggressively asserts his own conquering genealogy over all of them.
He doesn't just embrace his heritage, he uses it as a weapon. He claims he's descended from Attila the Hun, the scourge of God.
And he boasts about his Sekli's blood, saying that in it flows the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights for lordship. He's positioning himself as the direct heir to this incredibly violent, conquering past that just swept over Europe.
And this is where we have to ground the analysis in that Victorian context, right?
Yeah.
Because Dracula doesn't just see himself as a monster.
No, not at all. He sees himself as a political and a racial rival to the Western imperial powers. He specifically contrasts his own great and noble race, these ancient, persistent conquerors, with what he just dismissively calls
Mushroom growths like the Habsburgs and the Romanovs.
Exactly.
Okay, let's pause on that line for a second. Mushroom growths. Why single out the Habsburgs and the Romanovs? I mean, those were major established European
They
dynasties.
were, and for the British reading this, these are contemporary imperial powers. They're rivals, sometimes partners, in global geopolitics. By calling them mushroom growths, Dracula is asserting that his lineage, his ancient form of power, is just exponentially superior and longer lasting than any modern empire.
So he's essentially telling Harker, who is a representative of the British Empire.
That your whole system, your empires, your modern world, it's all temporary. It's a fleeting growth compared to his own savage, persistent power that sweeps the earth like a living flame. The fear is that the ancient East will conquer the modern West.
So the core anxiety isn't just a physical threat, a monster. It's this deep-seated xenophobic terror of the foreign master.
Yes, the racial superior hidden in plain sight who's going to destabilize the whole order. And Dracula isn't content to just rule his crumbling castle. He has this intense, calculated desire to master the very epicenter of Western civilization, London.
That calculation is so key. He's not just a creature of pure instinct. He's a super intellect, planned this for centuries.
And we see it in Harker's journal. He records Dracula's intense study of English books and maps and his specific detailed longing to go through the crowded streets of your mighty London, to be in the midst of the whirlwind rush of humanity.
And his goal, what he says he wants, is just terrifyingly precise because it targets the whole nature of urban anonymity.
He says, I am content if I am like the rest, so that no man stops if he see me, or pause in his speaking if he hear my words, ha ha, a stranger.
That's the Victorian nightmare. Not just a monster with fangs, but the unseen, unidentifiable foreign entity who can blend into the crowd, buy property, learn the laws.
And seize control completely undetected.
And the invasion itself is so systematic, it's almost industrial. This is not some mystical creature just floating across Europe.
No, Stoker goes into meticulous detail about the logistics of his attack. He's using modern infrastructure and foreign labor to deploy his supernatural assets.
Let's talk about the earth boxes. That's one of the most memorable details of the whole novel.
The earth boxes are everything. There are 50 of them, and they're invoiced as just common clay. They contain the consecrated earth from his homeland that he needs to rest and be safe.
And the transport is so detailed.
It is. He uses foreign labor, the Slovaks and the Sagani people, with their lighter wagons. So he's relying on the marginalized people of his region to move his life source. Then he uses the global shipping network. He loads the boxes onto the Tsarina Catherine, an Eastern European ship.
And sends the affliction right to the heart of the civilized world, arriving at the port of Whitby.
That detail is just so important because it shows the foreign threat isn't just supernatural. It's economic. It's logistical. He's using the West's own reliance on global trade and the exploitation of Eastern labor to achieve his goals. It's a calculated, organized, hostile takeover.
And this calculated foreign threat then manifests as a literal, viral corruption of purity.
Personified by Lucy Westenra.
Her slow, agonizing fading is documented in such gruesome detail through Mina's diary and Dr. Seward's notes. She is the beautiful, innocent Victorian ideal.
And she's being infected by the East.
And the first response to this infection is pure Western rationalism, which of course proves totally inadequate.
Utterly. Dr. Seward, the man of science, his only response is these desperate modern medical procedures like multiple blood transfusions. But before Western science can even get a grip, the local cultural protections are already at work back in Transylvania.
Right, Harker's given a crucifix by that hysterical old woman at the end.
And he, as an English churchman, a good Protestant, was taught to see such things as, and he says, in some measure, idolatrous. This is a huge moment of culture clash.
Why is that word idolatrous so important here?
It really highlights a deep theological tension. For the rational, Protestant Victorian mind, the crucifix, as it was used in Eastern Orthodox or Roman Catholic traditions, it often felt too close to idol worship. It was seen as a distraction from the pure word of God.
So by accepting this idolatrous object, Harker is already crossing a cultural line. He's admitting that Western rationalism and his form of faith are failing.
It speaks volumes about the limits of their own worldview, doesn't it? The common people, the coach driver, the innkeeper, and eventually Van Helsing, this foreign gentleman from Holland, they all understand the enemy through a lens of ancient superstition that the English scientific and religious minds just initially dismiss.
They see it as folklore.
Exactly. So Van Helsing has to use this crude foreign antidote, garlic. He has it sourced from Haarlem and telegraphed to England. And Lucy, who is the epitome of this civilized, delicate womanhood, she rejects it.
She throws the garlic wreath away with half laughter and half disgust.
Which is the civilized English mind rejecting the crude, visceral cure. And in doing so, she just accelerates her own contamination.
So their purity, their insular rationality, their inherent bias against anything foreign that isn't their own system.
That's precisely what makes them so vulnerable to this ancient, cunning Eastern voivode.
It's the ultimate irony Stoker forces on you. Their overconfidence in Western science and their specific brand of morality is the first crack in their armor.
They dismiss all the signs. The words the crowd shouts, or dog for Satan, Vilkoslak for vampire or werewolf. They see it all as just mere folklore. They believe they're immune to these primal threats right up until that threat is literally sucking the life out of their purest woman.
Okay, so if Dracula works as this external foreign invasion, he's also representing something terrifyingly close to home.
Yes. The raw animalistic desire that Victorian society, especially its men, were forced to just repress under all these layers of rigid morality and dignity and starch.
He's the collective-eyed, unbound and completely unburdened by guilt.
He is the beast unbound, absolutely. But he's not just a random beast. He is specifically coded as the anti-Victorian physical and psychological type. The sources give us these visceral, animalistic descriptions that are in such sharp contrast to the polite tailor gentleman Harker first meets.
So what are some of those specific anti-Victorian codes?
Well, his non-human nature is detailed so vividly in Harker's journal. First, his complete lack of a reflection in the shaving glass. That suggests an absence of a soul that can be recognized by God, or maybe an absence of a self that can be recognized by rigid social conventions.
And then there's that chilling image of him crawling down the castle wall.
Even more chillingly, yes, his ability to move downwards in a sidelong way, in his lizard fashion, down a sheer castle wall. He defies gravity. He defies human anatomy. It shows pure, untamed instinct, completely taking over rational control.
And his physical features, they just keep reinforcing this primal coding. Those broad hands with squat fingers.
And famously, that unsettling detail of hairs in the center of the palm.
What was the significance of that?
In Victorian folklore, hairy palms were a classic signifier of pure, untamed, and potentially excessive sexual instinct. It was seen as bordering on the degenerate. His nails are described as long and fine and cut to a sharp point. He's a predator, physically coded not just as evil, but as pure, uninhibited, instinctual energy.
And this uninhibited instinct is just absolutely intoxicating to the repressed English soul, isn't it? The best example has to be Harker's encounter with the three awful women, the vampire brides, in the castle.
I think the scene is the psychological core of this entire theme. When the fair-haired one bends over Harker, he describes this conflict between shame and surrender, but the emotion that wins out is just this shocking physical response. He calls it an agony of delightful anticipation.
The core Victorian conflict laid bare.
Totally. Here's Harker, a moral, engaged man, and yet he's completely overcome by this pure, uninhibited, non-procreative lust that Dracula not only personifies, but also permits in his domain.
He's drawn to the violation itself as this moment of immense psychological release for him, a temporary escape from the suffocating morality of his life back home.
A life he is, at that moment, desperate to get back to.
But here's where I want to challenge that a bit. If Dracula is just pure instinct, the beast unbound, why does he spend so much time calculating the English transportation system, studying maps, using legal contracts? Doesn't all that calculation kind of undermine the idea of pure instinct?
That's an excellent point, and I think it's what makes him so effective as a villain. He isn't just the beast unbound, he's the master of the id. He uses his intellect, his mighty brain, and that iron resolution, as Van Helsing calls it later, to strategically deploy the very instincts he controls. His desire is unconstrained, but his actions are controlled.
And that control is enforced with violence, especially when the brides try to claim Harker for themselves.
Oh, absolutely. Dracula ensures that all desire in his castle is always under his control. When the brides approach Harker to feed, Dracula's reaction is just explosive. He's consumed by a storm of fury. His eyes are positively blazing. The red light in them was lurid, as if the flames of hellfire blazed behind them.
He physically throws the woman away with a fierce sweep of his arm.
And uses the same imperious gesture that I had seen used to the wolves. It's an assertion of dominance, not morality. The brides might represent this unconstrained feminine desire, but Dracula controls the violence and the sexual predation. He channels the collective Id, which means his power comes not just from his own monstrosity, but from the power he holds over the repressed desires of others.
This whole psychological landscape of controlled instinct, it's perfectly mirrored in Renfield, isn't it? Dr. Seward's patient at the lunatic asylum.
He's essentially Dracula's cracked human mirror. He's a localized, institutionalized version of the exact same obsession.
Renfield's entire compulsion is based on zoophagy, right? This obsessive hunger to consume life, moving up the food chain.
Flies, then spiders to eat the flies, then birds to eat the spiders, and ultimately he craves a cat. He explicitly says he seeks life, not souls, which reveals this purely terrestrial, biological desire for vitality that just perfectly mimics vampirism.
And Stoker gives us these detailed diary entries from Seward about Renfield's mental calculus, which makes the madness so chillingly rational.
He isn't just eating. He's trying to absorb the vitality of one creature to extend his own life. He wants to accumulate lives, hoping that the multiplicity of lives in me will give me a longer life. It's this desperate, twisted attempt to achieve immortality through consumption, a perversion of life that directly parallels Dracula's feeding.
And Renfield is so sensitive to the Count's movements. He's constantly calling Dracula his master.
And his violent or quiet episodes almost always line up with the Count's proximity. He'll be quiet from moonrise to sunrise, which is Dracula's active period, or he'll show a sudden, fierce, sidelong look, which meant killing, when his craving is denied by Seward.
He's tethered to him, an unwilling psychic spy for the Count, which shows how the shadow self could be projected onto someone vulnerable.
But what's most telling, I think, is when Renfield finally turns against Dracula. Dr. Seward is trying to treat him with Western medical logic, demanding explanations, and Renfield's ultimate fear just reveals this massive spiritual chasm the Victorians were facing.
The madman is afraid of the soul.
Precisely. When Seward pushes him, asks him how they can get the life without getting the soul also, Renfield is horrified. He's terrified by the spiritual burden of the animals he's eaten. He fears being haunted by the buzzing and twittering souls of the insects and birds. It shows that even in his madness, he can't escape the idea of moral consequence.
Which highlights the exact moral line that Dracula crosses. Dracula operates on pure, amoral biology. He consumes life and just ignores the spiritual consequences.
Right. Renfield, the human who tries to mimic the monster, breaks down because he can't ignore the soul. Dracula, the pure shadow, simply doesn't care. And that, for the moralistic Victorian consciousness, is the fundamental terror. So if Section 1 was about the external threat of the foreign other, and Section 2 was the internal threat of the shadow self, we now have to turn that dark lens onto the heroes themselves. We have to examine the actions they take.
Because their mission is cast as righteous, saving Lucy and later Mina. But the methods they use, they involve horrifying violence and psychological control that often mirrors the very monstrosity they're trying to destroy.
This is where that comfortable narrative of good versus evil just completely falls apart. Let's start with Lucy's slow death, which is marked by these desperate, repeated, symbolic actions from the men who are trying to save her. It becomes a literal communal possession through blood.
It's an act of absolute desperate possession.
And philosophically loaded. Lucy gets 4 separate blood transfusions. Think about the sequence of who gives blood. First, it's Arthur Holmwood, her fiancé, then Dr. Seward, then Van Helsing, and finally Quincy Morris, the American.
4 different men, all of them either suitors or protectors. They are all literally filling her with their own lifeblood. This is so much more than a neutral medical procedure.
And Van Helsing makes the philosophical weight of it explicit. He insists that Arthur has to give the most blood during that first procedure. He tells Seward, "You took a great deal more from Art." And the reason is because he is her lover, her fiancé.
So Van Helsing is defining the blood exchange, not just medically, but socially.
Exactly. It's a desperate, symbolic act of communal possession and control over her failing body, performed by her suitors and doctors. They are fusing themselves with her. They're fighting the foreign infection by literally filling her with English, with Western blood, claiming ownership over her purity.
It's a physical attempt to override Dracula's spiritual claim on her. But this attempt to save her body also involves the systematic denial of her agency, of her peace. They treat her like a prize to be defended.
Absolutely. The text is full of descriptions of the relentless, intrusive guarding of Lucy. They lock her doors, they stand vigil over her while she sleeps, and they force her to ingest this foreign cultural medicine like the garlic from Harlem.
And Lucy, even in her fading state, she rebels against that treatment, doesn't she?
She does. When she throws the garlic away, it's with half laughter and half disgust. It's an act of defiance against the very methods meant to save her, methods that are incredibly coercive.
So the actions used to preserve her life, keeping her from the window, using narcotics on her, surrounding her with these men, they fundamentally deny her dignity.
They treat her body not as a person to be healed, but as an object to be protected and controlled. And ironically, that's precisely what Dracula was trying to do with his bite. Control her.
The horror then just escalates after her death when she transforms into the undead, the Bloofer Lady, a child's corruption, a beautiful lady who's now feeding on children.
This transformation is the peak of the Victorian feel of unleashed, unholy, and specifically feminine desire.
Stoker's description of the undead Lucy is just unforgiving.
She becomes the horrifying consequence of the shadow self unbound. When they finally confront her in the tomb, the text details her appearance, saying, "The sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness."
That is the ultimate Victorian nightmare, the good woman becoming a sexualized carnivorous threat. So she has to be stopped. But the method of salvation is nothing short of, well, ghastly mutilation.
The scene in the tomb is genuinely shocking. When Van Helsing prepares to open the coffin to begin the operation, Dr. Seward actually recoils in deep moral revulsion. He thinks it's an affront to the dead, as it would have been to have stripped off her clothing in her sleep whilst living.
He sees it as a profound, visceral violation, a desecration.
He frames it as a violation that's equivalent to sexual assault. And yet Van Helsing, the expert in the unconventional, he's just unwavering. He insists that only this extreme violence can restore her soul. He says they need a stake through him, cut off head that giveth rest.
The goal is purification, but the act itself is savage and deeply violating.
They have to become monsters to eliminate the monstrosity.
So how does the text rationalize this extreme violence? Is it presented as just a necessary evil, or does Stoker let us feel the immorality of what Arthur does?
It's rationalized through the idea of spiritual salvation. Van Helsing argues that staking the body releases the soul, it offers peace. But the physical description itself forces you, the reader, to confront the savagery of it. And the person who has to do it is Arthur, Lord Godalming, her fiancé, the purest and most noble of all her suitors.
So the narrative demands that Arthur, the man who gave his blood to save her life, must now be the one to perform the final gruesome staking. He has to strike the stake with all his might into her heart.
The irony is just profound. The civilized heroes have to embrace the violence that is inherent in their own nature to win. Arthur's act of physical violation is presented as his redemption. He has to transform his beloved's corpse to reclaim her soul.
He has to commit an act that is equal in horror to Dracula's bite.
To save her, it demonstrates that the purity of their cause requires the absolute horror of mutilation. They're desecrating the physical body to save the abstract soul.
It really makes you wonder about the long-term psychological costs for these men. They succeed, yes, but only by descending to a level of brutality they would have condemned in any other context.
And that necessity of brutality, of strategic compromise, it carries directly over into the hunt for Dracula himself. The heroes only succeed because they recognize they have to adopt his methodologies.
His cunning, his strategy, his use of non-conventional methods.
And they pay a profound cost for it, specifically through Mina Harker.
To counter the threat, they first have to acknowledge his overwhelming intellect, don't they? Van Helsing is constantly emphasizing that Dracula is no common monster. He's a voivode, a great military mind with the strength of many of his hand, cunning more than mortal, and a mighty brain and that iron resolution. He's been planning this for centuries.
That's a crucial distinction. We saw the lizard-like instinct, the pure id, earlier. But here, they realize that Beast is guided by a superior calculating intelligence. Dracula is a hyper-strategist, and that's why the heroes have to essentially become counterminers themselves, turning all the resources of Western science and organization against this ancient foe.
But Dracula proves he's the better strategist at first. He infiltrates their core defense system, Mina Harker.
He does. He boasts about his foresight, mocking their efforts. He says, whilst they played wits against me, I was countermining them.
He finds their one weakness, their reliance on Mina's organizational and moral strength, and he just turns it against them in one of the most terrifying scenes in the novel.
He forces Mina to drink his blood. He creates this unbreakable, horrifying bond. Flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, kin of my kin.
Can you talk about the sheer psychological trauma of that scene? I mean, it's this grotesque parody of a religious ritual. It's a violation of the highest order.
It's utterly profane. Dracula physically forces her head back and puts his own blood-stained mouth over hers, demanding she drink. And this act creates the deepest physical and spiritual contamination. Mina is physically marked by the red scar on her forehead, a tangible sign of her defilement.
And she instantly sees herself as unclean.
An outcast from God. This intelligent, virtuous woman is now compromised from the inside out. She is bound to the monster.
And that contamination is the ultimate cost of the hunt. Mina becomes a spiritual martyr. She's been violated and marked by the very thing they were trying to destroy.
And yet, the heroes immediately make the moral compromise to weaponize that contamination.
They do. Van Helsing, ever the pragmatist, realizes that this dark gift Dracula gave her can be turned against him. They use Mina's hypnotic trances, a power bestowed by the enemy, to track the Count.
They force her into a trance at sunset, the time of the Count's limited freedom, and use her involuntary perception to gather intelligence.
And her descriptions are so unsettlingly specific. Lapping of water, gurgling by, creaking of wood. She's describing the sounds of Dracula's box being carried downriver on the Tsarina Catherine.
They're using her as a human sonar device. And this is a profound moral compromise. They are turning the dark gift against its source, but the cost to Mina is staggering. She fully understands the implications of what's happened to her. She fears the spiritual consequences so much that she begs them for euthanasia if she shows signs of harming others.
She says, "If I find in myself a sign of harm to any that I love, I shall die."
That level of self-sacrifice is just immense, especially when you contrast it with the sheer primal fear the men experienced earlier in the book. Jonathan looks at the red scar on her forehead and sees it as a physical manifestation of God's knowledge of what has been. Yet Van Helsing assures them the scar shall pass away when God sees right to lift the burden.
So Mina becomes a martyr in this dark crusade. She's the only one willing to bear the physical and spiritual cost of using the enemy's own power.
And the hunt itself, the final chase, it just reinforces the enduring xenophobic foundation of the whole story as they race back to the east. The final pursuit is this race against time and geography. The men are highly organized, armed with the latest Western technology trains, steamers, telegraphs, and they're racing overland to intercept Dracula's slow-moving river journey.
They're basically invading the East to stop the East from having invaded the West. It's a reversal.
It is. But even as they travel into his domain, Mina notes the extreme superstition of the local Transylvanian population. They're crossing themselves, putting out two fingers to ward off the evil eye, loading their food with garlic.
Which is a crucial narrative detail. It confirms that the xenophobic fear the Victorians had dismissed as folklore is completely rational within that geographical context.
The locals truly fear the Nosferatu, and Mina has to consciously hide her scar and her true purpose to avoid suspicion from the very people who might otherwise help them.
So the ultimate victory is a deeply compromised one, then.
It is. It's only achieved because the heroes embrace the supernatural protections, the crucifix and the garlic. They adopted the enemy's cunning, the countermining, and strategic planning. And they leveraged the enemy's power against itself through Mina's contamination.
They won, but they survived by compromising the rigid Victorian codes they claimed to be defending.
They became masters of the shadow they were trying to eradicate. The monsters destroyed, yes, but the methods they used to destroy him are morally complex and brutally violent.
So, after this deep dive into the source material, what does all this mean for the traditional reading of the novel? The common idea is that Dracula is about light winning over darkness. But our analysis shows the victory was only achieved because the light embraced its own shadow.
And that shadow was fueled by both external fear and internal repression.
Exactly. Dracula is less an individual monster than he is the physical manifestation of everything the Victorians feared. He's an ancient, conquering, sexually aggressive, racially foreign force that threatens to destabilize their rigid control.
And the heroes conquer him. But they must first commit acts of violence, like the staking of Lucy, and psychological violation, like the contamination and use of Mina, that just mirror the monstrosity of their foe.
So the true horror of Dracula is realizing that civilization often has to embrace its own shadow, its capacity for calculated violence, its reliance on crude superstition, its willingness to sacrifice individual purity just to survive an existential threat.
The price of their righteousness was a calculated descent into necessary brutality.
And this leads us to a final, provocative thought for you to carry forward. Jonathan Harker's final note, written 7 years later, it offers this vision of domestic peace. He mentions his little boy named Quincy after their fallen friend, and he has this belief that some of our brave friend's spirit has passed into him.
But you have to consider what they truly inherited. Did they pass on the noble spirit of sacrifice? Or did they pass on the violent intensity of the hunt, that dark, ruthless efficiency they used to destroy Lucy and track the Count?
The text ends with the knowledge that the castle, the physical origin of this ancient terror, it still stands, as before, reared high above a waste of desolation.
That victory might have been personal for the Harker family and the other survivors, but the desolation, the cultural anxiety, the latent xenophobia, the need for brutality, that all remains rooted in the world. The monster is gone, but the conditions that created him and the compromises made to defeat him, they still stand, just waiting for the next generation to confront their own shadows. And a truly deep dive demands that we question not just the villain, but the true cost of the hero's success.